Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Audrey Lewis, Marketing Specialist at Telium, and I'll be your moderator. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. This webinar will last approximately 45 minutes and will also be recorded. The slides and recording will be made available at the end of the session. We have some related resources available for you in the attachments and links section of the platform, so please feel free to engage with them at any point. We want to make this interactive, so we will have a few poll questions throughout the webinar that we'd love for you to engage with through the Vote tab located under the presentation screen. Lastly, please use the Q&A feature to submit your questions. For any questions that we aren't able to answer live, we'll follow up with you after. This is the first webinar in our Definitive Guide to CDP series, where we will walk you through everything you need to know to get started with this powerful tool. The next webinar in this series will be on November 10th and will discuss CDP use cases for creating customers for life. If you're interested in attending, you can find the registration link in the attachment section as well. And now I'll introduce today's speaker. Matt Parisi is a Senior Product Marketing Manager at Telium. He has over 10 years of strategic marketing experience across both traditional and digital marketing channels. His experience spans industries working both at consultancies and client side. All right, let's get started. Matt, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Audrey. So let's head right into the presentation today. So it's probably not a secret to you at this point that the secret we're talking about today is a new technology called the Customer Data Platform. So for today, we'll be going over what a CDP is and why you ultimately would want one. We'll talk about how to build a customer profile that kind of stands the test of time, because I think we're at a kind of a point in history here where technology has been coming out. So we should be at a good point where we can consolidate and unify our customer technology with customer profiles and do it in a way that is going to be future-proof. We'll also go over what data is important to onboard into your CDP, because ultimately that kind of informs what you're able to do with your CDP, and then how to choose a CDP that's right for you, because there are a lot of different flavors out there. But why are we even talking about CDPs in general? And it kind of comes down to this statement here, and I think this is a very non-controversial statement, and probably every single, I don't know if you could actually have a business without understanding your customer through data to some point, but the point being that to innovate today, and you could use a different word than innovate, you could use win, to be effective, you need to understand your customer through data. And if you agree with this statement, even though it's non-controversial, I think the point that we need to make here is that if you believe in this statement, then you probably believe that there should be a tool in your stack that has this job, right? This is a pretty important job because you're going to be engaging your customer through a lot of different places. So that brings us to our first poll question. So anybody out there, go ahead and register your vote right now. I believe there's a vote tab that you can log your answer to this question, but which one of these challenges do you worry about the most at your business? And ultimately, this is an important part of determining what CDP is going to be right for you, but also kind of points to what challenges are solvable with a CDP. So what we have here, we have fragmented data, so data being across a whole bunch of different systems, tech stack integrations, which is kind of a similar concern in that every tool you're using to engage your customers tends to have its own view of the customer and its own set of, its own person managing it or its own team managing it. So that can be a big problem at organizations. Inconsistent customer experience is another symptom, and operational inefficiency with data. Everyone wants to be data driven, but when the rubber meets the road, a lot of times we aren't able to quite be as efficient as we would like. So looking here, it looks like inconsistent customer experience is the one that's coming across in the audience. And ultimately, I think that's probably the highest level benefit of a CDP is going to be that you're going to provide a consistent and effective customer experience in the context of everything you know about that customer across all the channels where you're engaging with them. So, you know, just like there are a lot of symptoms, there are a lot of causes for these symptoms. And each one of these kind of causes in the market kind of points you towards a certain solution or a set of requirements that you'll need for your technology. So number one, we have regulations that vary by geography, like GDPR in Europe and CCPA in California. So that kind of points to the need to have a tool that will allow you to manage the data based on geography. Second, we have third-party data for targeting and attribution is really under assault, thereby significantly increasing the need for a first-party based strategy instead of a third-party based strategy. Many customer acquisition programs are run by simply buying a pool of third-party cookies to target those users. Let's say these are people who ad networks believe are interested in buying a car or a house, or they have kids or something like that. But the cookies that are used to target those people and to understand those people and to measure success are becoming less effective and less usable. And with Chrome actually dropping support for them in 2022, we have a really narrow window to make that shift from a third-party based approach to a first-party. Third, people have also been using ad blockers for years. Mobile usage also continues, which has a different set of data requirements than online data or offline data or web data in general. And then browsers are technologically changing, like we just mentioned with Chrome. And all of these factors are kind of conspiring to increase the need for more consent and privacy-centric approaches with data. So that's another change in their strategy. And fourth, all of these kind of combine to make the walled gardens more powerful. So your Facebooks, your Googles, big publishers who control many different websites where consumers might be engaging have a significant advantage now because brands aren't going to be able to as effectively go out and buy kind of their audience to target. So those walled gardens will become more powerful. And with that power is going to come expenses and costs, right? So the brands that are able to best own their own data and own their own customer data are the ones who are going to have a competitive advantage targeting their customers and measuring the results ultimately. So that brings us to kind of the definition of a customer data platform that's out there in the market. And I think this is, there are definitely the majority, I think I read a stat the other day that 75% of marketers report a positive ROI from CDPs. And what I would say for the other 25%, it's likely that a CDP could deliver value, but perhaps what they've done is they've chosen the wrong CDP. And I think where it becomes hard to choose a CDP is when it comes down to these definitions and the requirements. So number one, there's just a lot of CDPs out there that do a lot of different things. But number two, that is because the definition here that you see is pretty generic. So a customer data platform is packaged software that builds a persistent, unified customer database that is accessible to all other systems. When you really dig into that definition, virtually any software system meets that definition. And when you look at the customer data platform category and look at the companies that call themselves the customer data platform, this definition is a reason why they're able to do that. There's a lot of attention on CDPs now, so there's benefits to be gleaned by calling yourself a CDP. So this leads to kind of confusion in the market. And ultimately, we think that we need to have a better definition. And we talk about basically a data-first customer data platform. We think that a data-first approach to a customer data platform is the right way to go that will ultimately benefit the greatest number of users within your business and will also stand the test of time because of the fact that you are focused on the view of the customer itself as the output. A lot of CDPs manage the customer data for a particular tool, whether that tool is website personalization, email, display ads. There could be a lot of different tools that come with CDPs, but once you manage your data for a particular tool, all of a sudden you have kind of a compromised motivations for what you're doing with the data. Instead of managing the data in a way to give you the best view of the customer, you start to manage the data in a way that's the best for the execution of that tool. So we really believe that a data-first approach to a CDP is the right way to go. And what that means is that your CDP needs to collect data in a governed way across many different data types, which of course is very difficult to do. Secondly, it unifies that data to create accurate customer profiles in real time. So if you're engaging your customer, you need to be able to engage your customer at the speed of the customer, right? You can always slow down, but it's really hard to speed up. So having your customer profiles available in real time, you know, you have to dig into that, right? Because ultimately that means that if you have data coming from two different places, there needs to be some calculation that occurs within that unified platform in a very fast way, which is very difficult. And then lastly, a data-first CDP makes that data accessible to, and here's the important part, actionable for other tools and technology, right? So it's not like you send the data over to this other system, then you need to manually do something with that data in the other system. The data, you know, your data platform, it's right in the name of customer data, needs to make this data actionable. Like that, you need to be able to trigger that email. You need to be able to serve that ad at the right, you know, at the right time. So, you know, why do you need a CDP? I think we've talked a little bit about the benefits that a CDP has, but I think by looking at Tealium's own history of product development, you can actually get kind of an illustration of the larger tech trends that are out there, and it can give you clues as to kind of your own maturity growth with customer data. We have a pretty good record at Tealium of kind of anticipating industry trends going back even before Tealium. So the founders of Tealium actually founded a company called Website Story, which was real-time web analytics. It was one of the first real-time web analytics companies out there, inventing the JavaScript tag for the purposes of tracking. So that experience led to Tealium IQ Tag Management. Now, the reason why Tealium IQ Tag Management was kind of the next logical step from there was because we could see how analytics data was kind of getting stretched to its limit, and we saw the need for kind of a vendor-neutral data layer on which customer experience could be based. Because over time, you change analytics providers, you bring in new data sources. So ultimately, that data layer allows you to move from tool to tool. It gives you a consistent view of the customer. At that time, we didn't have any identity resolution technology to sit on top of it. But eventually, you know, by being kind of the hub of all this data that was flowing through these tags, and virtually every martech has a tag, we were in a great spot to say, hey, we can actually start combining and unifying this data, because we can see that this person over here using our search ad is actually the same person over here from our website, you know, and we can kind of combine the identity of that person in our customer data platform. So our customer data platform came out in 2013, before the category really existed as it does today. But you can kind of see how we started with kind of that event level data, just picking it up from all the different places it was. We started with the web because that was kind of the major source of customer data, you know, back in the earlier 2000s. And then as we, you know, kind of grew, we added more and more data types and ways of unifying the data and working with the data for the purposes of activating it, because that's what we're talking about here. The scope of what we're talking about is customer engagement data. And customer engagement data is the data that needs to be the quickest moving, and it's also the most important, because ultimately that's what manages your customer relationship. So if you don't have that customer data right, your customer experience can get a little wonky. So as we were doing this, other companies have, you know, done similar things. Now, I would say that some of the companies have kind of shifted into the CDP market more based on positioning than their product. But the value of what a CDP is and that definition of, kind of working with customer data across a whole bunch of different channels and combining it to provide one comprehensive view of the customer, there is some clear value here, right, based on the fact that this category has experienced explosive growth. We're now well over 100 companies calling themselves a CDP here in 2020. And, I think that proves that there is this need to do it. But there are a lot of different ways and a lot of different reasons why you would want to centralize customer data for the purposes of engaging your customer, right? So that's why we see these different types of CDPs emerging. We have campaign CDPs, which are the ones that are more focused on a particular channel or a particular execution of the data, like website personalization, sending emails, serving display ads. We also have API hubs, which I would say are kind of, a lot of people refer to these as pipes, basically where you're kind of just, there's data all over the place, and sometimes it's just a matter of getting data from one place to the other. So you kind of have CDPs that emerged out of kind of centralizing the orchestration of data. And then you have marketing clouds, which of course are now all coming out with their own CDPs, but their CDPs exist more for kind of handling customer data within their own ecosystem than going out to the wider world. And with, kind of the trend towards best of breed tech stacks, that might not be the most solid approach to plan around. So we would add a few useful distinctions to that definition to make the definition of a CDP more useful, because ultimately these are things that you want your CDP to do. And if you pick certain types of CDPs, you're not going to be able to do all of these things, which isn't a bad thing. It just means that the value you're going to get out of it at the end of the day is a little bit more limited than it could be. So we look at things like the CDP should provide a company-wide agnostic data foundation. Agnostic means that, we're not managing the data for a particular tool. We're not managing the data to send an email. We're not managing the data to serve a display ad. We're managing the data to have the best possible view of the customer, because we know if we have the best possible view of the customer, we can always integrate that to where it needs to go. And that's where it comes in with connecting to disparate source systems. So, we believe in an approach of kind of connecting disparate source systems through the customer profile, which ultimately makes all of those source systems kind of act within the same context. But that means that you have pretty dynamic identity requirements, because it's hard to manage customer identity across a lot of different data sources. And then that view of the customer needs to be persistent for use in other technologies. So it can't be, based on only one session or, one page view. It's got to be kind of exist over time, which makes it more difficult, right? How long you're retaining customer data for is important, not only for the purposes of using it to target customers, but also for privacy and consent purposes. And then lastly, this data should be available in real time. You can always slow the data down or your actions down if you need to, but you want those insights in real time, because ultimately customer expectations have reached this level based on all the technology that brands have to engage today. So moving on, we've talked a lot about why you want a CDP. Let's talk about kind of the specific types of data that you could bring into your CDP. And this is where we'll get, forward there, let me go back. And this is where we get kind of into that further distinction. So I talked a little bit about if you don't take kind of a data first approach and you take more of a marketing first approach or a campaign first approach, basically that's what the approach that a marketing focused CDP would take. And that's what we call it. Ultimately, this approach takes care of an extremely important task, because of course, engaging prospects to become customers is really important, but it doesn't address the full customer journey and kind of repeats the exact same mistakes of the past that have led to so many companies to have these unwieldy, inefficient tech stacks think I saw a stat the other day from Gartner that said that marketers are only using about 60% of the functionality in their tech stacks. And I think it largely comes down to this, this approach where you're not kind of unifying all your technology around the same set of data. Essentially, a marketing-focused CDP would take a bigger silo approach. So definitely better than having a whole bunch of small silos, but ultimately it's still a silo. And we contrast that with what we call a data-focused CDP. And a data-focused approach, on the other hand, would build the view of the customer as the outcome first. So no matter what tool needs to use it, a data-first CDP constructs the best view possible with the idea that you can make it portable wherever it needs to go, as opposed to trying to marry data management with the execution tool. So, doing customer data with an email tool or doing customer data with a display ad tool. So getting more into specifics, what kind of data are we talking here? Well, it starts with anonymous data. This is the data that you know about a user before they become known to you, before they become a customer. These are things like clicks, web page visits, IP addresses, heat maps, maybe recordings of user sessions, user preferences, abandoned carts even, because you would, if they abandoned their cart, you wouldn't know who that person is yet. These are largely events that have been performed by a particular user before you know who they are. This data is absolutely critical. The value of pre-customer data is huge because once you know that person, you can kind of connect the dots backwards, and then you know about how did they find you? What did they look at as they were researching? This is really important information to inform the customer relationship. Many CDPs will only let you track customers once they're known through login or identification of some kind, so don't overlook the importance of this anonymous data. Next, we have customer level data. So then we have the data that comes after you know who the user is: email address, social handle, name, email, home address, methods of payment maybe. This data is really important for getting to know your customers on a personal level and for engaging or analyzing how you're doing. I would say that by and large, most CDPs are going to be pretty powerful in this layer. And this is naturally a much smaller data set though than that anonymous data, right? So that anonymous data is the data that's going to let you more acquire customers and achieve scale. And that is basically where marketing data or a marketing focused CDP would basically end. So definitely good set of data, excellent set of data. And if I'm a marketer, I can start to execute some campaigns using data from many sources, which is definitely better than doing it from only one source. But it is a limited data set that serves a smaller number of use cases and serves a specific team, right? But there are many teams within an organization that would benefit from that consistent customer profile. So let's look at some of this data. So there's really a lot more data out there. We call it omni-channel offline data. This is customer service calls, brick and mortar visits, to the store, maybe beacon activity from IoT devices tracking user location in a store, offline purchase history. All of this data has a ton of value for engagement purposes, right? Because the reason why we're consolidating all this data is for the purpose of activating customer engagement. If you can't get this data, your view of customer engagement will never be complete, right? Because customers exist outside of just your website, outside of just your mobile app. They visit stores, they engage with your brand in other places. So you really want to bring all of the data that you can think that would be useful for customer engagement into this customer profile. Then we have sensitive data, and sensitive data is things like health records, credit scores, even genetic data maybe. This data further builds our picture and is probably the smallest set of data and the data that needs to be managed most sensitively. But the value of this data can also be the highest because it represents the most unique and the most the biggest insights, most unique to that customer that you can possibly have. So this is really important data too, and being able to work with this data is really useful. So this is a good stopping point for us just to look at the next poll question. So given all of this different data that we're talking about bringing into the customer profile, who do you think should own the CDP? What group within an organization should ultimately be the one who owns it? Because all of that data we talked about is valuable for a lot of different reasons. You have privacy data in there for legal. You have IT, which is just trying to build applications with customer data. You have analytics, who's trying to, get insights out of the customer data. And of course, marketing, who is on the front lines of customer engagement. Let's see here. And it looks like, I don't see any answer. It looks like marketing. Okay, so marketing is a very logical choice of who should own the CDP. But I guess what I would say about having one group own it is that if one group owns it, you might not necessarily have the greatest perspective on the value of that data across the organization. So ultimately, we believe in taking a center of excellence approach, and we actually did a study on the companies that get the highest return out of their customer data efforts. And what we found was that the companies that take a center of excellence approach, meaning that they have a representative from every part of the business in a customer data center of excellence within the organization, those are the organizations that returned the most value out of their customer data. So while each one of those groups has a strong, kind of case to be made for quote unquote owning the CDP, we ultimately think that the best result is if you can kind of have a cross-functional group. And that brings us to the topic of customer identity, because if you are managing all of that customer data, identity becomes a very important topic, because you want to tie all of that data to a particular person, because that is, of course, the only way you're going to be able to engage that person and leverage the insights from that data. And when you kind of are constructing an identity that kind of exists between all those data points that we talked about, I think the point that has to be made is that you need a dynamic solution that kind of matches the scattered nature of martech. It's important to note that all of this data is gleaned over time. So like when we talked about, gathering data on anonymous users, for example, like if you don't have that capability, your identity is going to be far more limited, right? It's going to be chopped off in the, in the middle of this slide here, and you're going to have your customer profile is not going to have kind of all that browsing data from early in the customer journey. So it's critical to plan in your solution, because it means that you're going to have a spectrum of customer identity to work with, and your system's capabilities need to match that. So this approach, for identity basically sits between kind of the extreme anonymous targeting that's done through DMPs and display ads in general. I will say that, kind of the way that media is targeted is kind of under assault, as we talked about earlier, with third-party cookies. So that's what we're talking about, moving a little bit more towards the first-party approach. And then on the other end of the spectrum of kind of data, kind of anonymous to customer data, is kind of like master data management platforms that deal with like customer, customer transaction data, maybe their credit cards, maybe their addresses. There needs to be a system kind of that sits in between for martech, because you need a certain degree of scale. MDM is not going to give you the scale, but you also want to know who the customer is, and those anonymous systems aren't really going to tell you who the customer is. So that's really where the CDP sits, kind of connects the dots between those ways of understanding who your customer is. And to sum it all up, at the end of the day, this data-first approach unlocks the greatest value, and there is certainly value in marketing data on its own, but looking at the benefits of an enterprise data-based approach we can see some serious advantages of being data first, right? It fuels a best of breed tech stack, right? Versus having data that's more limited to, just a particular department. It empowers the entire customer lifecycle. So it goes beyond customer acquisition, beyond kind of the awareness phase, and serves the entire customer lifecycle into customer experience, customer support, because customer data for those departments is extremely important as well. It builds the most complete customer profile, right? And with the most complete customer profile, you have the best context within to manage customer engagement, instead of having a limited customer profile where you only see marketing engagement. Maybe you don't see like customer service engagement or customer support engagement. And then lastly, flexibility for multiple use cases across the org, which is kind of a further to that, that point that we just made, is that it's not only using the data for advertising and marketing analytics, but it's using that data across the organization, which ultimately is going to benefit the customer. So how do you pick which CDP is right for you? This is our last poll question here. So when you're picking a CDP that's right for you, ultimately what you need to do is you need to determine why you're building that view of the customer. That is going to dictate kind of which system is going to be the best fit for you, because there's a lot of different reasons that you could ultimately bring your customer data together for the purposes of using it in some way, right? You could bring customer data together for the purposes of engaging your customer, right? You could bring your customer data together for the purposes of coming up with insights. You could bring your customer data together just to be more efficient, if it's inefficient to go and get your data from a whole bunch of different places. So there's a lot of different reasons, and we have a bunch of these reasons listed here. So we have data unification, we have real-time access to customer data, data-driven customer engagement, send better emails and do better website personalization, and we have run better reporting. It looks like for our viewers today, it looks like data unification is kind of the main reason for bringing it together. But looking at these answers a little bit more closely, I think you'll see a difference between answers A, B, and C, and then answers D and E, right? Answers A, B, and C are focused on the quality of the data, right? They're focused on the data itself. Answers D and E are focused on what you are doing with that data. So if you're focused on specifically the outcome of the data, then that's going to point towards certain systems. If you're looking to send better emails or do better website personalization, you want to pick a CDP that has an email tool and a website personalization tool, right? Which not all CDPs do. Some just, like Telium, for example, would partner with best of breed email and website personalization tools, and we would trigger them with the insights from the customer data in Telium. Same thing with run better reporting. If you are interested in consolidating customer data for the purposes of reporting, that would point towards an analytics-focused CDP, as opposed to a CDP that's focused on kind of producing the best data set, right? Because reporting goes into kind of data visualization and those kinds of topics. So, so picking out what your goal is with your customer data can ultimately help you, pick which one's going to be the best for you. Some challenges that you might be, identifying as things that you want to solve with your CDP are lack of a single customer view, inability to ingest data from any channel, limited real-time functionality, working on privacy and consent management, because ultimately if your view of the customer sits in a customer data platform, well, you better have a way of layering privacy and consent on top of that, or else you're going to run into regulatory issues and also just customer experience issues, because customers are becoming much more sensitive over time to that. And ultimately that means you have requirements across a few very critical areas. So as you're evaluating CDPs, I think you'll want to evaluate them in these 5 categories to help make sure that you pick the right CDP for your goals. So you have data management. This is things like identity resolution, kind of the dynamic nature of identity resolution. Can you manage the ID resolution, or is it kind of a black box that you're kind of stuck with? Can you bring in offline data? Can you bring in unstructured data? What data can you ingest is going to be a big one there. Can you bring in anonymous data we talked about? Secondly, analytics. Identify and create customer segments for targeting, right? What are your features for that? How can you understand customer interests? Are you able to define customer interests on your own, or are you kind of stuck with what the CDP gives you out of the box? And then use of predictive modeling and AI and machine learning is going to be increasingly important over time. You want to have an answer to that because we're already at a point where there's too much customer data to analyze, and we need help from AI and ML to do that. Third, orchestration capabilities. So creating customer journeys using data and sending those customer segments to different platforms and channels where the customer can be engaged. You know, specifically, I would say definitely evaluate the integration marketplace. Like, do they have the integrations that you need? And if they don't, you know, it would be hard for any single system to have every single integration you need. What capabilities do they give you to, you know, kind of create your own integration? Because there's a spectrum there as well of, you know, easy to very difficult solutions, and you just want to know what you're getting into. Fourth, we have integration. I guess you kind of talked about that in orchestration, but inbound and outbound sources of data, site analytics. You know, can you bring in CRM data? Can you bring in marketing automation data? And then lastly, but not least important, data regulation and privacy is kind of becoming a primary concern. And in fact, when we get to 2022, it's going to be even more of an issue. It's going to be, you know, marketing departments are likely going to have to manage, you know, consent and privacy like they manage ads today, because ultimately, if you don't get that consent, your targeting ability is going to be greatly diminished. So there are some overarching considerations also to keep in mind. At the end of the day, all these criteria need to be blended together to pick the right solution. So looking at solution fit, you're definitely going to want to evaluate functionality and business requirements mapping. So kind of map the features of the CDP to the specific initiatives that you have. Integration to technology stack, we already talked about, like how many of the integrations you need or want does each system have? Ease of implementation, you know, what's the time to value is going to be a big difference between systems. Alignment with customer internal process and support. So like, are there workflow tools? Are you able to kind of map the tool to your organization? And then of course, total cost of ownership is a huge concern. There's a lot of places where you can get more data and more insights to help you. And I would say, you know, this is chapter 1 of our definitive guide to CDPs. So if you haven't checked out the full kind of definitive guide, this is an intro to it, but there's a lot more detail on a lot of these topics that I'm talking about in there. We weave in industry research from the customer data platform, from Gartner, taking into account all the kinds of CDPs that are out there. So definitely take a look at that document. And then, you know, contact us, and we're of course available to help figure out how we would approach your particular challenge. And then lastly, you know, some kind of sample activities to go through to pick the CDP that's best for you. You know, you're going to want to run surveys across the organization, understand your tech stack. So you're going to want to do a tech audit, and that's where you're going to know kind of what integrations you need. Integrations with key stakeholders. Remember, I said that customer data is really valuable across the whole organization. The more stakeholders you can kind of get on board with kind of a consistent, unified approach, the better it's going to be for your customer and for, you know, ultimately the experience you're building at the company where you work. And then performing analysis and recommendations, of course, is extremely important. And we have more details in our definitive guide to customer data platforms, which I believe are included on the links below our webinar here. But We are going to have a Chapter 2 webinar on our definitive guide that's going to be done by my counterpart, Jake Spencer. He is going to go over acquisition, loyalty, and retention, how a CDP creates customers for life. So a little bit more on kind of the customer lifetime life cycle. The entire guide is, of course, available, and we do have some additional information on kind of the difference between building and buying a customer data platform, because that's kind of a decision that many organizations also grapple with. And I would, at a high level, I would say I would encourage not thinking of it as build or buy, but think of it as building and buying, and kind of like, what are you going to build and what are you going to buy? Because ultimately, you don't want to be in the business of building things that are commoditized. You want to be in the business of building things that are unique to your business. So, I think I have come to the end here. Audrey, is there anything else you would like to say before we sign off?
Everyone who is interested in the second webinar in our Definitive Guide series, it will take place next Tuesday at 11 a.m. Pacific time. So be sure to register for that and check out the attachments in this webinar. And thank you everyone for joining, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.